one question that someone submitted for your consideration may be one you don't want to answer, which is that
So you're going to start with that?
Yeah, I'm starting with
Okay,
it because I'm kind. If you were in the situation that Paul and Barnabas were in when they were disagreeing, what would you do?
Interesting question. Certainly appropriate given the passage. Honestly, I think my own proclivity or temptation would be to try to work through the thing until it got resolved. And if I couldn't resolve it, then I would probably be tempted to give up that issue of conscience. And I find those kind of splits or bifurcations to be really, really painful and disappointing. And so I think in the past I've made some mistakes in letting myself go way too far than I should have. So I don't think that's what one should do, but that's what I would be tempted to do.
Now, what if an issue that there is this conflict about between people, what if some people would consider it an issue of sin or not sin, and other people wouldn't consider it an issue of sin or not sin?
Yeah.
And that's what the conflict is over.
Sure. The related passage that would help us get there is in the book of Romans that speaks to the stronger and weaker and different conscience issues that they have. And so ultimately, if I believe something to be sin but isn't, and I do it anyway, then according to Paul in Romans, it is sin. So if I think it's sin, even if it isn't sin, and I do it knowing I think it's sin, then it is sin. Because I've broken what I believe to be my conscience before God. And so in that kind of situation, the parties who think it's sin, then certainly you can have conversation about that and try to reach a point of seeing it the same way, meaning seeing it as a conscience issue or a sin issue. Hopefully you could resolve that. But at the end of the day, if not, then I would hope somebody wouldn't reach this conversation in an hour, or this decision in an hour, that it'd be multiple meetings, multiple weeks. But eventually, if that's the conclusion that person reaches, then they need to stick with their conscience in that.
So the conscience is more important maybe than we think it is in American culture?
Yep, very much so. We tend to have conscience, things we think of as conscience issues that aren't. They're just preference. So the example I used in the first gathering today was the church sings 3 songs right now instead of 4. We normally sing 4. So is that going to be a matter of big disagreement? Well, certainly in a church like ours, that seems silly, but that kind of thing happens. And that's personal preference. There's no conscience issue there. So we would just need to be sensitive to actually asking the Lord to strengthen our convictions and to weaken our hold on personal preference issues.
So it has to do with maturity then too, in how we view these things?
Sure.
One person asked, I had forgotten that Paul asked for John Mark to come visit later. That's really awesome. John Mark is John Mark also the author of Mark, the book of the Bible?
Yes. Same guy.
Same guy. That's pretty cool. How do we know that?
Well, it would be easier if the New Testament and Old Testament, actually, key players had last names or had jerseys. So at times it's confusing. But you have to go through all the occurrences of somebody's name in the scriptures and try to piece together the evidence and then carefully reach a conclusion about what you think. and then go check that with people who know a lot more. So that's exactly what I did.
Wow, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Jumping back to conscience.
Okay.
What are some examples of conscience disagreements that might matter?
You mean as opposed to something that would be a personal preference issue that I should just set aside?
Yes,
Okay.
we just had a brief interlude of John Mark, and we're basically just continuing
Okay.
that exact thing. Like, what would the difference be between the conscience and the preferences?
Sure. Well, I would think that someone who's fully convinced in their own mind that Old Testament circumcision has been replaced by New Testament baptism, and that therefore an infant should be baptized. I think that's wrong. I don't believe that's the position the New Testament teaches. However, there are lots of people who disagree with me. There are people I really respect and have learned from, and I would not at all doubt their sincerity or their salvation. And if you reach that conclusion at the end of the day, then you ought to be in a church that believes the same thing. Because that's just too big of an issue for you to set aside your own conscience. I couldn't join a church that baptizes babies because I believe the New Testament clearly teaches baptism is post-salvation. And to baptize someone prior to that may in fact confuse them later in their lives. And it isn't really a baptism. And so that's why I'm part of a Baptist church. And so, again, I don't see that as bad or unfortunate, but rather just the reality of a point in which Christians do disagree, and yet we can still be brothers and sisters in the Big C universal church, but we're not going to be able to be in the same local church because that's such a critical matter. I would apply the same thing to things like a church's membership statement of faith, or a membership statement of fellowship, or a church covenant, or maybe some things around what is the place of the decisions that the church members make. So there are some churches that are called elder rule, meaning the members of the church aren't asked to vote on most everything. The elders do it all. I think if you disagree about that, you probably need to find a church where there is agreement. But there's a whole bazillion of things that wouldn't fall in those buckets. Those are few and far between.
You mentioned in the sermon gender nuances that a church believes. Could you tell us what you meant by that phrase?
Sure. So obviously, issues related to gender fill the news right now. They're very explosive. You can't turn around without hearing something related to LGBTQ, and so that's put the whole issue very significantly on our minds all the time.
Absolutely.
So, in our context, what I'm referring to is the fact that from the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, we're told that God made male and female, and that from that point on, consistent, the message through the rest of the New Testament is that we are made, you as a woman and me as a man, are both made to image God, but not in exactly the same ways. And that's a good and beautiful thing. And that has bearing in the home and in the church. And that whole matter, and we'd have to have a whole couple-hour Q&A just on that.
Yes, absolutely.
To unpack it all. But at the end of the day, the scriptures teach clearly that godly, qualified, called men should serve as pastors, and godly, qualified women should serve as deacons. And that if a church does otherwise, it is in sin. However, 1 1st and 2nd Timothy both speak to this in more detail. And particularly an issue that I was thinking about in relationship to this is the scriptures teach that the preaching of the word should be done by the elders or people who are in the track of becoming elders. And therefore, that the teaching and having authority function in the body is limited to godly called, qualified men. But where do you draw the line at what is authoritative teaching and what is the simple discussion of the word that isn't done with some kind of authority? I think that's a matter that's gray and that every church has to decide on. And so if, for example, a church were to decide, well, that line for us is only in gathered worship, I think that's a decision they can make. While another church may decide, no, we really see that as applying to all mixed gender audiences in which someone's standing and saying, this is what God says. That's the position we've taken. So post high school, any teaching that's done, we think, to obey 1st and 2nd Timothy, should be done by godly qualified men. But if somebody just cannot get there, then they're not sinning by going somewhere that would abide by that in a different way. That's a long answer, sorry, but it's just one of the more explosive kind of issues in our day.
It definitely is.
One that requires a lot of listening and careful, attentive conversation.
Jumping topics, how did the circumcision in chapter 16, the beginning, how did that not wrongly communicate to the Jews? Like, oh, you're right, they should get circumcised.
Yeah, understandable question. I think it had to do with simply the initial beginnings and ability to have a conversation with a unbelieving Jew. And so certainly if you got to the point of presenting Christ and the person would be clearly hearing, Jesus fulfilled the law for you. Therefore, all the ceremonial laws and sacrificial laws and civil laws have been completed in Christ, and you don't have to obey them any longer. They would have gotten there, and which would have then probably raised the opportunity to discuss the difference between law and grace. So I think it actually would have helped, not hurt.
So it opened a door.
Yep, exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think that might be all the questions we have time for today.
Okay.
Thanks for talking with us, Pastor Chuck.
Sure. Thanks for asking great questions.